Good afternoon. I'm Mark Lawrence. I teach at the University of Texas at Austin, but have the great privilege this year to be here at Williams College as the Stanley Kaplan visiting professor, which means that I get to enjoy every day the hospitality that James McAllister and Williams has shown to all of us over the last day or so. So I want to thank James in particular for that, and the other organizers of this conference for what has been a fascinating event so far. And I think it promises to continue to be fascinating with this final panel. My predecessor here as chairman started us out with a pretty memorable story about an elephant giving birth. I don't think I can touch that. So I will bring us back actually to the volume and quote from Richard Nixon. He says, in a document that's already been cited a couple of times, document 195, any possibility for continued progress in the future with the USSR and China, who are continuing to build their military strength, will depend on our military strength. An echo of something we were discussing earlier. He goes on, though, to say, we have a problem of public relations. Many don't care what many don't care what position we have. We must explain our attitude and that of the unilateral disarmers. What will the people and the Congress support? We also have economic, budget, and balance of payments problems. But I can't accept the argument that these must govern. There is a level beyond which defense can't be reduced. It is most important for diplomatic and psychological purposes. And it seems to me that this quote neatly captures at least what I take to be the central theme of our panel. That is to say, it captures the awareness of and the concern about the political, the social, the budgetary, the military, and other kinds of constraints within which the Nixon administration had to make policy. So to help us think about this theme, we have three wonderful and very productive scholars, and we will proceed in alphabetical order. First up will be Beth Bailey, professor of history at Temple University. Her biographical description that she provided for the conference is actually very modest. She has quite a long list of publications of all sorts. Her academic accomplishments are truly prolific, but perhaps most important for her comments today, her most recent book is America's Army, Making the All-Volunteer Force. Second up will be Tom Schwartz, professor of history at Vanderbilt University. Tom is also a prolific historian of the Cold War. His publications include, as many of us well know, America's Germany, J McCloy and the Federal Republic of Germany, Lyndon Johnson in Europe, in the shadow of Vietnam, and lately he's been working, among other things, on Henry Kissinger. And finally, Chris Tudda, who is a historian in the Office of the Historian at the U.S. Department of State. We will speak. He's a specialist in the declassification and publishing division of the Office of the Historian. He is also author of a couple of books already published, is The Truth is Our Weapon, The Rhetorical Diplomacy of Dwight D. Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles. And we're looking forward to his forthcoming work, A Cold War Turning Point, Nixon in China, 1969 to 1972. And Chris also teaches at George Washington University. So thank you very much. I will get out of the way.
Thanks. One of the reasons that my biography was so short is because I wasn't quite sure that I was going to be able to convince people who study national security and such that I'm someone that they should be listening to by citing titles like From Front Porch to Back Seat or Sex in the Heartland, which are two of my previous works. So we'll stick with America's Army. Okay. It's 1968. In the 10th month of what had thus far been a very, very bad year, and Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon has just gone live on national radio about 2 weeks before the presidential election and promised to end the draft. Okay, now as campaign promises goes, this one was a doozy. The US was at the height of its commitment in Vietnam, and he hadn't any sign-ons. He hadn't had any quiet conversations with military leaders. He hadn't been talking to people involved in national security. He hadn't even run this by the man who was going to be, his Secretary of Defense. This is symbolic politics. This is a proposal from the man who had said he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. And most people in the know took it with about that much weight. It was an unvetted and fairly radical campaign promise, and a lot of people thought that once it had served its symbolic purpose, it was going to fade away very quietly. But Nixon kept his pledge. One of the first things he did as president, only 9 days after his inauguration, was to initiate the formation of what would be the Gates Commission, the President's Commission on the All-Volunteer Force. Now, I was going to use an analogy, but all analogies have fallen into comparative disrepute after the elephant giving birth, but I'm going to try anyway. I was going to say that Nixon's promise to end the draft was like tossing a huge boulder into a pool, except the pool was already, the waters were already roiling so much, the huge boulder, sort of the splash dissipated very quickly, and it's very hard to trace the ripples in all that churning. But I'm going to try and trace a couple of sets of ripples here. The reason I'm here is because I've written about the creation of the All-Volunteer Force focusing on the Army. And to my benefit, the documents in this volume, a little bit belatedly, since the book came out a couple of years ago, fill in some of the gaps that I've seen in the distance between the proposal to end the draft and its implementation in 1973, including some really fascinating internal struggles and watching Melvin Laird try to convince the Nixon administration that this wasn't going to be quite as simple as the Gates Commission was making it out was something that was really beneficial to me. They just didn't quite seem to get it. But it also allows us in here to chart a different set of ripples, and forgive me for my lack of background in some of the issues you've been talking about. But the All-Volunteer Force was a new factor that had to be calculated into decisions about, first of all, global strategy and force structure, secondly, about foreign policy and the relations with the Allies, and thirdly, about domestic politics, public opinion, and relations with Congress. So, true to the title of this session, the All-Volunteer Force functioned much more as a constraint at this moment in American history than any kind of opportunity. And perhaps most interestingly for this group, as a constraint, it did play a role in at least some debates about the proper balance between general purpose and strategic forces. So, my starting context here is the document, The U.S. Military Posture and the Balance of Power. I think it was 131, I'm not quite sure. The one that was given to the NSC in September 1969 to set out potential post-Vietnam alternative global strategies, security strategies, and the force structure that was going to be necessary for each one, most particularly in light of at least a somewhat rising concern about China. And my favorite exchange about China was from 1970. Nixon goes, "What we need is proper bargaining position with the Soviets," and Kissinger interrupts to say, "And the Chinese." And Nixon goes, "Yeah, and the Chinese, yeah, that's right." So he's being reminded. Here, though, budget is a critical issue and the most important of the AVF-driven constraints. As the NSC administration officials are costing out the proposed worldwide strategies, from the least expensive, the $72 billion annually, NATO initial defense and assistance for allies in Asia, ranging up to the more expensive $102 total NATO defense and joint defense of Asia. They were also worrying about guns and butter, and they were worrying about tax increases and inflationary pressures. The defense budget was not going to expand in any substantial fashion. It was much more likely to be cut. Kissinger is worrying here that defense cuts are going to set off public relations battles between the services that are going to rival those going back to the 1950s. And Richard Nixon elsewhere says, "The hell with them all." The proposed AVF increases the proposed volunteer force is going to increase pressure on the budget enormously because it's going to be very expensive to end the draft. The Gates Commission comes forward after an odd set of deliberations, if anybody wants to go to Abilene and look through them, having ignored almost everything that's going on in the country and used a labor supply model that essentially says if we pay people competitive wages, they're going to join the military. Now, this is a very unnuanced labor market model that economists would never try and use today. And the military is going, it doesn't work that way. It's not just a job. We can't just pay them more money. It's not going to happen. But pay, increased pay, is going to be the starting point no matter what the military is saying. And even if that pay increase is only equivalent to competitive beginning level civilian wages, it's still going to cost, as they're plotting it out right now, if it's implemented before the drawdown in Vietnam and the reduction in force that's going to follow, and at least an extra $3 billion a year when they're talking about cutting defense spending. Now, there's a rather plaintive moment in the Defense Program Review Committee meeting. You can see I turned all the pages. In March 1970, when they're working their way through all these defense budget issues, and someone, at this point, it's before the recommendation for the Gates Commission being accepted, somebody brings up zero draft, and you can just hear Kissinger sighing. If we have zero draft, we'll have to change all the projections. Who will do this? You can just imagine somebody's weekend just got totally ruined there. Now, the rise in the cost of personnel is going to matter a great deal, in part because of how the defense budget is distributed. As is repeated at least twice and maybe more in these volumes, 60% of the proposed post-Vietnam defense budget goes to general purpose ground forces, and manpower obviously is the most important element of that, while less than 25% is to go to strategic forces. Now, it's clear that they have different functions, everybody understands that, but if manpower costs are key to this 60% of the budget, and manpower costs, personnel costs will grow disproportionately because of the AVF, budget pressures are going to require attention to either the size of the force or to the balance between general and strategic forces. And perhaps, it will provide a tool for those who want to shift that balance. And I found a really interesting set of conversations about that in an Oval Office conversation that included Nixon, Kissinger, and John Connally, the Secretary of the Treasury and a former Secretary of the Navy. And Connally in this conversation notes that manpower accounts for 60% of the defense budget, you know, conflating things about it still. Nixon verifies that, and Kissinger proclaims that shocking. Connally then uses the cost of manpower to make this case, quotation. So I would cut manpower wherever I could, not to destroy any of the services, but I'd cut them as much as I could and put that money into the acquisition of ABM, Polaris missiles, or whatever to enhance your strategic capability. To which Richard Nixon replies, that represents my general view too. Now, in fact, Nixon had justified his proposed move to the AllVolunteer Force, partly on the basis of individual autonomy and Chicago school economics, but also based on his claim that in future wars that there will no longer be the age of mass armies, and what the U.S. needs is a smaller, more technologically sophisticated, better trained force. So, you know, this language had already been there in this discussion. Now, the second major constraint that the AVF introduces is uncertainty. Is it going to work? Can the U.S. fill its military ranks with volunteers? In those early years, the Army alone was talking about getting 20,000 to 30,000 volunteers a month. This recent war, 60 to 80 a year, 60, 80,000 a year. It's an enormous number of people. Is slightly higher pay going to motivate young men to volunteer? You know, the Vietnam War is largely off screen in these volumes, but it wasn't out of people's minds. What of rising anti-militarism? What of loss of respect for the armed forces? What about the new culture of youth? What about the mess that was going on in the U.S. military by the early 1970s? And perhaps most importantly, given the shift to total force planning, in which the reserve was going to play an enormously important role, and given the fact that reserve enlistment was very, very, very heavily draft motivated, or as Nixon said, it's a shotgun wedding, how are they going to get people to enlist in the reserves? So as they're trying to assess the impact of such uncertainties, one of the key things that they decided they needed to do, and this is after the Gates Commission has given its report, but the Nixon administration has not yet recommended it, they asked, what's going to happen if the AVF fails? And Nixon asked for a study of NATO responses to the proposed all-volunteer force. And the Secretary of State argues that the Allies are very concerned about the proposed move to the AVF in and of itself, because some of them see it as a sign of a reduced U.S. commitment to collective security in Europe. But more than that, they're concerned about its potential failure because, as, quote, knowledgeable Europeans understand, if the U.S. has trouble filling its ranks, it's going to be in the Army. And the size of the Army force in Germany is understood to be a key sign of the U.S. commitment to NATO. Now, these kind of uncertainties and resulting fears act as constraints when it comes to thinking about relations with the Allies. But I'm also struck by how little attention that I see in this volume, and I'm not sure how much of that is decisions about what to include and what is otherwise, to the mess that was going on in the military, particularly the Army, during this period. Because the conversations about using general ground forces and relying heavily on the military, when military leaders themselves, especially in the Army, are saying we are facing a crisis, that's largely missing here, and I'm wondering about that. Okay, less important for our purposes here, but I want to bring it up anyway because I think it does matter, is the domestic issues. And for that, that's where you have to look to documents that are well beyond this and to think about some of the initial impetuses toward Richard Nixon's idea of getting rid of the draft. Key is that Nixon, like Johnson before him, complained anti-war and anti-draft protest and believed that if he could reduce the reaction against the draft, he could reduce the reaction against the war. He's missing an important layer, but this is part of his motivation. Now, he hoped that this proposal to end the draft will do it. Obviously, he can't do it till the war's over. He can't do it as soon as he's hoped. The Vietnam War is not ending. There are not lines of young men storming the recruiting offices, volunteering to go fight in Vietnam. They're not going to be able to do it yet. And the budget isn't going to allow them to come up with the proposed pay increases until they get a reduction in force. So deferring this promise is introducing even more volatility as the war is continuing on. And Nixon has to get Congress to approve an extension of induction authority from 1971 to 1973. A lot of people in Congress say, that's a good way to signal my disapproval of the war, to try and cut the war off. It's going to be a very difficult thing to do. That introduces more volatility, more uncertainty. And so one of the ways in which Nixon is trying to handle this is by doing draft reform, which was not his initial idea, but he wants to make sure that this is very public and that people understand he's taking action. He urges everyone to publicize the corrections to the inequities. I would urge you, just if you're having a few free moments and are looking for something fun to read, to look at the debates about draft reform in here, page 494 to 496. If nothing else, because it has some really wonderful Nixon quotations for you. Just two of them before I stop. One of them is, they don't know what they want to do, so they go to divinity school. and the other is, when it was discussing people not showing up for their draft calls, that's because of all those Swedes there. Okay, and let me just finish by complimenting and thanking the organizers of this conference and saying how much I've enjoyed being part of it, and complimenting those who created the volumes. They're immensely impressive, and they have been a great benefit to me as I've tried to understand the domestic ends of this by looking at the strategic pieces. Thank you.
I speak at the sort of end of a conference in which, as I've mentioned to a couple of you, my best quotes and that have all gotten stolen already by previous speakers. I accept that. I do have one quick memory from as a very intimidated graduate student, my first interview with John J McCloy. McCloy wasn't one to focus on things. He liked to tell lots of stories, but one of his favorite stories was meeting with a Soviet diplomat. McCloy was brought in by Kennedy to negotiate some of the details after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And McCloy used to tell the story about the Soviet diplomat as they would be working out some of these details, finally saying to him, "You will never catch us like this again." And to McCloy, what all that meant is that the Soviets were absolutely determined never to be in the position of inferiority that had forced them to withdraw from Cuba. And he always interpreted subsequent events, and many of you have seen him in these volumes, as coming out of that Cuban Missile Crisis. This is my second chance to be back at a sort of semi-State Department event. I really relish that. I got a chance to come back into the fold at the Vietnam conference, where I also got a chance to see some things I never thought I'd ever see, namely Henry Kissinger surrounded by a bunch of dignitaries from the Socialist Republic of Vietnam and having his picture taken with big smiles and all of that. In looking at this title of this paper, of this session, Evolving Constraints, I think evolving is a way to talk about, since the constraints are not necessarily fully formed and clear from the outset. The Nixon administration would face a range of constraints on its ability to shape American foreign policy. Eventually, they hoped to turn some of the constraints into positives, gaining the political credit, I think, that would come from catching on the wave of some of the public sentiments. And some of the constraints changed over time. One of the points I want to stress here is that over these 4 years, you do see a certain political dynamic emerge. Remember, Nixon is elected very narrowly, only by a slight percentage. You know, granted, he often, and Kissinger, in fact, in one of his discussions with Anatoly Dobrynin, talked about always seeing the Nixon and Wallace vote as the same and recognizing that there was this overwhelmingly more hawkish or tough policy, but nevertheless, Nixon wins very narrowly. His first 2 years are actually very, if you look back and follow, they're not a very successful politically for him. He starts off with this idealistic, and forgive me, I mean, it sounds very familiar, but at his when he was accepting or acknowledging his election in that November morning, he starts off by saying how he saw a little girl holding a sign, "Bring us together," and so that the spirit of his presidency would be bringing all together in a sort of nonpartisan, all of which now sounds very remote from what he would actually do. But his first 2 years were very difficult, and politically he faced a real crisis after the midterm elections in 1970, and he did not look, he says in his memoirs, he didn't think he could even be renominated, which I think is exaggerating, but he did not look like a clear victor. So I think that some of that has to be kept in mind when you think about the political overtones in the volume, because that's, I think, was very important. In fact, it was so important that in the Dobrynin-Kissinger volume, you find Dobrynin telling Soviet leaders in January of 1971 that Nixon so emphasizes. Nixon had Kissinger go to Dobrynin and threaten the Russians not to be as receptive to Senator Edmund Muskie's visit. And Dobrynin says, we can see how sensitive the president is to his democratic opponents, and suggesting that the Kremlin consider that they can use that political sensitivity in some ways. And I think that certainly it is there. I also want to mention that in reading these volumes, I also found myself thinking about the cycles in American history. There's a lot of contemporary overtones. They reminded me of the last few years in American foreign policy: war fatigue, economic malaise, a desire to shift spending priorities, shifting the burden to the Allies, focusing on Asia. There's one line in here in which Nixon says we should think about Asia now instead of Europe as the priority of our policy. And there does seem to be a type of phenomenon of recent American history, a sort of cyclical way in which draining wars like that in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan produce a sort of reaction. Obviously, the situation is very different, the presidents are different, but it's still, it did remind me very much of that in looking through. The nature of the constraints. And here I'm going to try to be a little briefer than I had originally planned. Economic has come up. It's not as much a structural economic, although I think there were real concerns. Remember, the recession of 69-70 was a pretty serious one. I reminded myself by going to the Vanderbilt TV archive, still one of our great resources, that there were news stories in 1970 about Germans and Japanese sending care packages to laid off workers in Washington state. And this was, for the American psychology, this was pretty devastating, this first major post-war recession, first recession in quite some time. And I think the sense of the United States going through real problems economically was certainly one of the psychological factors I think that Nixon had to face. It certainly also affected his thinking about how he would win re-election and how he could possibly win re-election. I just recently showed my students in a different capacities, showed them Lyndon Johnson's March '68 speech. Usually the only part people see is that I'm not going to run for president again, that sort of line, I won't accept the nomination on my part. There's another line, is shortly before that he quotes Kennedy's "pay any price, bear any burden," and saying how this is something we have done. And it's almost like it's a valedictory to that. And I get the sense very much that when Nixon comes in, the sense of having reached a point in which the United States, that there really was a sense of having turned a point in which the United States would now have to borrow a line from our current president, nation build at home. And certainly the sense of social crisis that produces the large-scale increase in entitlement programs. Now, Nixon always rather crudely refers to this as, oh, more money for the ghettos. But what he's getting at, the degree to which social programs and other costs were now going to be clear priorities for most Americans in both public opinion and in general, I think is very strong. And that is, I think, even Nixon at one point talks about the health of our economy as an essential element of our strength, but I think the sense that the country has shifted its understanding, and that in order to remember why that was, we have to remember the sense of social crisis that had come with the Civil Rights Revolution, the riots of the 1960s, the unrest in general that had really shifted people's sentiments, and then really the coming due of all the Great Society programs, many of which expanded. In fact, Joan Hoff got a whole book out of sort of concentrating on Nixon's domestic policies, which are also congressional priorities as well, and the spending that involved. The constraint of public opinion has already come up a number of times. I want to emphasize one point that hasn't. You see the beginning of the controversies about the military-industrial complex. In a meeting early on in his presidency, Nixon, the February '69 meeting, talking about the ABM, talks about the misconceptions out there. It's $100 billion that we're threatening the Soviets. And then he goes, the acid test of presenting the issue properly, he goes, we have to explain decision when it is made that it doesn't give credence to the military-industrial complex, doesn't look like a new round in the arm race, doesn't frighten Soviets, doesn't worry money people. We have to say failing to do this little would be highly irresponsible act. We can't be apologetic. The military-industrial complex as a political concern really took off in 1969. Now, in some ways I see, and I had a research assistant sort of dig up some references. Some of this is connected to the death of Eisenhower in March of '69. The obituaries almost always mentioned his farewell address. And the New York Times did a huge story in June of 1969 in which, in its magazine, in which it concluded excessive military spending has contributed to a misallocation of national resources, and society has already suffered irreparable harm from the pressures and distortions thus created. And I think that sense, not the targeted sense that the military-industrial complex, the spending for defense, was out of control, and then a new arms race was in vogue. And particularly one sees that, again, I cite the evening news, the coverage of the ABM vote on the evening news in August of '69 is all centered around that. And not long after this, some of you might even recall the CBS did its famous Selling of the Pentagon documentary, which attacked military spending. And I think in that sense, there was a very strong reaction and powerful sense in public opinion against spending for defense. So we've already talked about the challenging environment that the Nixon people faced, but that was another element of it that was all there. Obviously, the Democratic Senate, in particular the importance of the Senate during this period. we've seen in more recent times, and sometimes I do think you write history, you're always thinking about current events too, but how a Senate or House can be a particular barrier for presidents. For Nixon, it was the Democratic Senate. He could get things through the House. The Democrats, there were enough conservative Democrats in alignment with Republicans for most of his measures through the House, but the Senate was a real problem, as the ABM debate had shown. This quote, I think, has already come out, but it bears repeating in the SALT volume when Nixon is coaching Haig about dealing with right-wingers, to simply tell them, you know, we can't get from Congress the additional funds needed to continue the arms race with the Soviets in either defensive or offensive missile category. Just that this concession, just knowing you're not going to get that funding, does shape and change, I think, a lot of the debates, and it's a powerful constraint that exists on Nixon throughout developing and then throughout his first term, and comes to fruition and expression frequently in the volume. There's also constraints within the American government. We've touched on it already, the number of battles Nixon did with various Defense Department about the budget. There's a line in the NSP volume from July of 1971 where Nixon, in a conversation with George Schwartz, says, "Never has a country spent more for less defense than the United States." And you see, in a way, Nixon has to respond to a public environment in which, of course, cutting defense spending is absolutely central, but he doesn't want to do it in ways that are going to hurt his bargaining power, going to damage his reelection chances, all of that. So he comes up with all sorts of things that he really dislikes, certain defense programs, his deep dislike of the flyboys in the Air Force, which comes up constantly. He has this thing about the Air Force and the amount of money they want to spend on air defense that seems to be targeted. He's very angry that the services will split any budget in threes, talks about that constantly. And I think that degree of antagonism within the government that he felt, Nixon also, of course, has already been referenced, felt that he had tremendous problems dealing with his own bureaucracy and how they dealt with things. On the SALT negotiations, one of the quotations that I loved was at one point Nixon wanting to stretch out the negotiations on SALT till the summit. And Kissinger comments, "If Kennedy were the president, the whole goddamn bureaucracy would be stalling for the summit." The sense that he's always dealing with a bureaucracy that is in league with his political opposition, and makes life difficult for him. Let me, though, bring my key point, and this is one that I do wonder whether we'll be able to do without tapes and the sorts of extraordinary materials that are in these volumes. And I also want to just praise the compilers for their willingness to tackle the extraordinarily difficult task of listening to all these tapes, listening to all this material in order to bring it in. If any of you have listened, the telephone tapes are a little easier, but the regular meeting tapes are hard on you, and they are a real challenge. That's the domestic politics of all this, and I want to just stress this. It already came up as well. Aaron Mahan mentioned it at the end of the SALT volume. There's so many references to it, and it's so critical that Nixon was so eager to get credit for SALT. As contemptuous as he could be of what he called the pathetic weakness for the concern for arms control and Americans, what he called naive trust in summits and international agreements, Nixon wanted the peace issue. And if you recall, Nixon grabbed issues from his opponents. After all, he's the one who said he became a Keynesian. We're all Keynesians now with his wage and price controls in '71. He stole the China issue from the Democrats, in effect. Now, he did it carefully and secretly, but they were certainly pushing for an opening to China. He stole the issue of peace, and he got it fully under and understood it. In April '71, getting the peace issue was critical to his reelection. And when SALT developed, as Aaron mentioned, there's one point at which Kissinger talks about keeping expectations low because of the Democrats, that if you kept the expectations low for what the summit will produce, you have a bigger bang. And Kissinger's memo, of course, citing that you will deserve personal credit for the breakthrough in SALT, all of that. And I think the stuff that's in these volumes has to be put in the larger context. It's already been mentioned how important it is not to read one Frew's volume separate from others. Obviously, I think this could be linked to the decent interval concept on the Vietnam War. It could be linked to lots of other, I mean, Nixon, yes, Nixon had thought seriously about foreign policy and national security, but he also thought an awful lot about being reelected and about how to get reelected and how to use foreign policy achievements in order to get that reelection. And if you put that together, you see through the tapes an obsession with making sure that the political credit from all of this becomes part of Nixon's 1972 campaign. In that sense, there is a way in which one thinks about Nixon and the struggle for power that he didn't really make a distinction between the struggle for power and dominance abroad and that at home. So I'll close on that point.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to first of all say thanks again to Josh and Bill in my office for giving me the opportunity to come here. And when they sent out an email to the whole office, they said, you know, we want to see if anyone in the office would be willing to participate in the conference. And I leapt at the chance because I felt that I had two things to contribute. One is that I declassified or coordinated the declassification review of both of these volumes. I also declassified the arms control volume, the non-SALT arms control, and we just passed a milestone in the SALT II volume. We're getting very close to pushing that into publication process, and I'm also working on the successor national security policy volume that Todd also compiled. So I think I had a unique perspective in understanding a number of different things. The other part is my own personal scholarly and teaching interests, which include Nixon, China, and this idea that many of the previous speakers have talked about, and that is this idea of a relative decline in American power that Nixon faced when he came into office. So let me briefly mention, as Ted, Aaron, and Todd mentioned, putting these documents together wasn't easy. I saw probably just a smidgen of what they actually saw in the archives. When it came to what they chose to include in the volume, the documents that end up in the footnotes, and then, of course, some of the documents that didn't make those two cuts, what we call the discards. And then you can add the thousands of pages of documents that are actually in the archives. And these particular issues of national security policy and any kind of arms control have a standard for declassification that are almost akin to some of the issues that we have in documenting covert action. And that is because, as Todd in particular mentioned, these are very high-level documents. But they're not only just documents that show us the discussions at the highest levels of government, but they're also highly classified. That makes them harder to declassify because, as you probably imagine, the agencies that are involved in these, whether the Defense Department, sometimes the CIA, the National Security Council, White House, and even the State Department, are not always as open as we are, and our government is incredibly open in what we publish. And it's truly amazing to me what we got in this volume. But it was hard also to push some of these documents through. Todd, you may or may not remember some of the arguments and appeals that we had with different agencies, because sometimes the agencies they may want to protect a name or a number or a sentence, but they'll take a paragraph or sometimes a page. And so it tends to become the art of choosing documents that Aaron and Ted and Todd have done for years in these particular volumes. It's an art. It's not easy to pick which documents we're going to put in. It's also an art to try to get them all declassified, to try to get as much information out as we can. And obviously, no volume that I've ever worked on is perfect. But these volumes in particular took a lot longer. And in fact, the irony is that they were originally assigned to a different person in our office who was an Army veteran. And everyone just assumed that he would do arms control because he'd been in the Army. Turns out he doesn't really like doing arms control. And he begged me to take these volumes, and he traded Chile for me. Chile 6973, which has not come out yet. So 6 years ago, I think, is when I first began the SALT I volume and also the arms control volume. So then I naturally picked up national security policy. As someone who came into the office in 2003 as an Eisenhower scholar or expert, I knew a little about arms control. I knew a little about national security policy. I had no conception of what I didn't know. And so these volumes were my learning volumes. I started to understand what agencies are necessary to allow a document to be published in full. In other words, who gets to take a crack at it? Which agencies have the final say on the matter? How do we get the best documents out? So that's one reason why these took so long. So I apologize. But the second part of what I wanted to discuss today is about this overall idea of a relative decline in American power that Mel mentioned earlier. And I brought a couple of extra volumes, so if anyone is interested, I brought one of the Vietnam volumes that we published last year, and also our most recent Soviet Union 72 to 74 volume. So if anyone is interested, feel free to grab them, first come, first served. And if anyone wants volumes, I'd be happy to send them. We have a lot of extras. Because Mel is right, there is a larger perspective here that sometimes we tend, I know I do in my own writing and my own research, to try to drill down to a small, manageable subject. But the fact of the matter is that there is this larger narrative going on. And I'm not exactly a Nixonite. I admire him for some things. I don't like him for other things. But I do have a sense of what this guy faced when he came into office. And unfortunately, Ed has already used the elephant line, but there are a lot of elephants in these rooms. First, you have this enormous responsibility for the fact that a nuclear war could occur and 90 to 100 million on each side could die. So, as Professor Friedman noted this morning, well, maybe we can get it down to 40 or 50. There's a fundamental irrationality about that whole discussion. Then they're also dealing with Vietnam. The nation is being sapped, as Tom and Beth both mentioned, by this economic crisis that is beginning to reverberate as Nixon takes office. The guns and butter argument used to be one or the other, not both. And now we have this new phenomenon of stagflation. So Nixon is getting clobbered on all ends. Our allies, Germany and Japan, who we have rebuilt deliberately, have gotten more powerful and more quickly powerful than we expected. So in relative terms, we are declining as a power, whether it's economically, militarily. Tom mentioned the political aspects of this domestic unrest. Now, I don't have a lot of sympathy for Nixon because he wanted it and he got it. He ran for president. And now he's in office and he has to deal with the fact that the United States is not number one anymore, although that's what he believes. And Kissinger already believed this. Jeremy has pointed out in his book that he was obsessed with limits, this idea that constraints and the idea that nuclear power didn't necessarily make you all-powerful. In many respects, having nuclear weapons could constrain the United States. It limited its flexibility. So there are all these things happening as he takes office. And what I chose to focus on today is 1969, the first few months. And in fact, many of you have already cited that February 14th, 1969 NSC meeting, but I think I found one quote that no one mentioned. And that is, if you recall, Packard, his Deputy Defense Secretary, is trying to reassure Nixon that, you know something, don't worry so much. We really are technologically far more advanced than the Soviets are. They really have a lot of catching up to do. But Nixon doesn't buy it. And what strikes me as I reread this volume from probably now the 6th or 7th time through all the appeals and all the declassification is his lack of confidence. And this lack of, a bunch of people have used different words, but I look at it this way, as this lack of confidence in the future. And it's not because of anything he's done. And it's funny, psychologically and whatever, that Richard noted this morning his constant discussion of the Cuban Missile Crisis and how Kennedy had it so good. Well, if we all recall how close the world came to nuclear war in 1962. However, as a number of you guys have mentioned earlier, we had this 5-to-1 superiority, and it's gone. But look at all the things that come up in that February 14th meeting. And the first thing Nixon says after Packard tries to reassure him, he says, quote, "My point is fundamental, philosophical, goes back to Sputnik. Freezing in a failure to experiment to move on." Remember, these are notes, so it's not exactly he doesn't talk that way. They enjoyed an enormous propaganda victory, the Soviets, back in 1958 when they launched Sputnik. Then he says, breakthroughs are immense political and psychological value. Are we moving forward adequately? Packard has to concede that the Soviets, and this is important to note, the Chinese have begun producing not only more and more weapons, but they are putting an enormous amount of money into scientific production. They're churning out more and more scientists who presumably are being diverted into the nuclear program. So things are not going so well. And then Laird pipes in. And Laird says, you know, we've been forced to spend all this money on Vietnam. Guess what the Soviets have been doing? They've been outspending us 4-to-1 on overall defense and by a 3-to-2 ratio on strategic and offensive weapons. How long is that going to continue? Beth and Tom both mentioned these economic constraints that the United States and Nixon has to deal with in his first month in office. How do you go to Congress and justify more and more spending on the military when we are stuck in Vietnam? Are they going to approve all this? The ABM fight, it's a huge fight. How are we going to justify this spending? And then Nixon says, okay, I understand the political climate, but the aggressiveness, that's the word he uses, of Soviet foreign policy, and a number of you all noticed this morning, and their newfound confidence, what do they think we have? This has created a new situation where, quote, we may have reached a new balance of terror. And the interesting thing is, when I teach in my class in 45 to 68, we talk about mutually assured destruction, and this idea that there is some kind of rational balance between the United States and the Soviet Union. But it's really predicated on American superiority. That's gone. Or at least they believe it's gone. In the first month of his presidency. Now I want to step back and again what Mel said about looking things at a larger perspective. Less than a month later, and Bill knows this well, the Chinese and the Soviets began the first of 3 border skirmishes in this remote region of China, of this disputed area between the two countries. And all of a sudden, he's now confronted with the possibility of a Chinese-Soviet war that could go nuclear. It escalates even further in August, when the Soviets decide it's their turn to attack. And in the National Security Policy volume, you see documents 62 and 63, the editorial note, which is a summation of that August 14th NSC meeting, where Nixon, for the first time, according to Kissinger, makes a, quote, revolutionary thesis, which I strongly shared, that the Soviet Union was the more aggressive party, and that it was against our interest to let China be, quote, smashed, unquote, in a Sino-Soviet war. In the earlier context of a relative decline in American power, now the United States has to decide what to do about a potential war between these two communist adversaries. But, and my research into this, I've discovered, and this is sort of related to the Joint Chiefs of Staff readiness test, Nixon says we are not going to take advantage of this. He instructs Kissinger. And Kissinger, there are a few documents here where Kissinger wants to see if he can play what becomes known as triangular diplomacy. But Nixon says we're not going to do this because he is scared to death of a nuclear war. So I wonder, I don't have the answer for this, but I wonder if he really was trying to be a peacemaker. It shocked me because the assumption being my own theories about triangular diplomacy and other things, I assumed that it had begun pretty early on in his presidency. But when I looked at it and reminded myself of the documents that are in this volume and that are in some of the other volumes, I sort of came to a reassessment of Kissinger and Nixon, and that Nixon was very careful until 1971 not to try to take advantage of this new strategic situation. Especially if you take a look at the next document, document 63, that's when, and Bill knows this, Boris Davidov's meeting where he kind of floats, what do you guys think if we take out the Chinese nuclear facilities? What might you do? Well, when Mao hears this, what does he do? He sets off a nuclear weapon in Mongolia. The interesting thing is now that we're starting to see sources from other countries is that the Soviets were also feeling out their allies about potentially attacking China. And when Nixon hears this, now it's probably, there's a good chance that this guy was not, he was just probing to see what was happening. There's a good chance he might have been a KGB guy to try to figure out what's going on. But Nixon is worried that this is really serious, especially when we start seeing these documents over the last decade on the Cold War International History Project and in other articles about the civil defense measures that the Chinese were starting to take. Evacuating cities and getting the people out there to potentially plan for a war. In that situation, this constraint of being the United States, I would argue, is very similar to this idea that our power to influence these events is declining. We can only do one thing, I would argue, and that is to make sure we don't take sides. And let the Chinese and Soviets hopefully come to a quid pro quo, which eventually they do. They just decide to sort of table the border issue. But this is a very scary situation. And here's the irony. Tom and I have talked about this before. Why did they institute the readiness test? Especially when they are so, or at least Nixon is so worried about a possible Soviet-Chinese nuclear exchange, or at least an attack on nuclear facilities. I'm not sure if I have the answer to that. Jeremy's written about this, Bill has written about this as well, but I look at it as part and parcel of this larger concern that many of our fellow panelists discussed this morning about credibility. Our power is declining. So if we can do something that will, as Wheeler and others say in this volume, and a couple of people noticed this morning, if we let the Soviets know what we're kind of doing, but we still keep most of it secret, it's a way to ensure that America can still be a player. I know it sounds kind of strange considering we know how powerful the United States is. And yet I, looking at these documents, was struck by this lack of confidence that Nixon had. And then the last thing I'll say about this is that for someone who is constantly talking about linkage, my own research, not only into this episode, but also into other episodes about surrounding China-U.S. rapprochement, is that Nixon was very good at compartmentalizing, and that he could institute the readiness test and not really worry about how it might affect China. He invaded Cambodia in 1970, didn't really care if it affected the talks that were going on in Warsaw, because for him it was all about larger issues, which to me was very surprising considering linkage is supposed to take one area and take another area and get cooperation based on trade-offs. And I think that was surprising to me as the documents in this volume and also in the other volumes that I've either declassified or used. So I think the lesson that I've taken from these documents, as well as the SALT volume, is that this psychological uneasiness that Nixon felt in this new world of whether you want to call it parity or equality or relative decline really affected more than just whether or not the United States was going to push through arms control. Thank you.
solid 20 minutes here at least. Please.
On constraints, I agree in general, as we talked about earlier today, that domestic politics were not permissible. It's very, very hard to find. I agree with that. But I wanted to ask specifically about the economic situation, which you discussed, and the defense budget. At a glance, this seems like a serious constraint. You want to be flexible, you want to be agile, you want to do everything you can in the world, and yet you don't have that much money to spend on it, and rising defense costs means you can get less for every dollar you spend than you could 5 or 6 years earlier. But I'm wondering if this also strikes me as an opportunity. There is one point in which Nixon and Kissinger ordered George Schwartz to basically use the declining budget to go after the JCS. Right? Use the threat of less money to force them to be more serious in their discussions rather than, as Nixon put it, debating each other about how they're going to do 33, 33, 33. And it's very, very resonant with the current debate that people are having today, that declining defense budgets will lead to more sensible decision making. So I'm wondering your take about this. Did Nixon use this this budget lever effectively with the JCS, or could he have done more?
I'm not sure how effective it was. I think you're right to say, that the fact that the climate was such that extreme or cuts in defense, and the concept of the time was the peace dividend. The notion was that the end of the war in Vietnam would produce large expenditures or large amounts of funds for peacetime expenditures. So he could use it. And certainly, the general defense budgets fall, but I'm not sure that you can really say that that he was able to crack into and force different spending priorities among the services. Well, first of all, I don't know it well enough, but secondly, from the conversations, it seems far more frustrating for him that he can't seem to push past that. You're right that it certainly was there, and everybody knew it was happening, and so it could be the Defense Department recognized it too, but whether that could push past the level down to special programs. I mean, he never got rid of the air defense. Never got, the stuff that he complained about. So.
There's a line in there, I can't remember exactly where it was, where he said this is going to force them to come up with a clearer rationale. That doesn't mean that anything happened, but what I see is interesting, and it's a narrow approach to some extent, is the ways in which these perhaps unforeseen costs that were going to be attached to manpower constrained some of the options, or gave people tools to make their arguments with that I don't think that the Nixon administration really foresaw as he's trying to talk more about rationales and rationality there.
I guess in the readiness sense, the documents are pretty suggestive that it's really a strong Vietnam angle to it, because Haig has a memo on this October 14th. The second to last paragraph is the effect that we've got to get this stuff going so he gets a signal before November 3rd when Nixon gives a speech on Vietnam. That's certainly a strong Vietnam emphasis right there to see, so Nixon can tailor the speech accordingly to how the Soviets are reacting to these signals. Now, whether the Soviets ever understood that it was a Vietnam thing is another question, and someday we'll know what they were thinking. But, I think the Vietnam angle is pretty. I think the documents give different views of the documents, but I think it's.
And those were some of the documents surrounding that were a little harder to get out in full than they might have been. But it was good. We have a really good relationship now with the Defense Department and the agency, where they're more and more willing to give us more information, or at least make the excisions smaller. And so I felt like we really did a good job of getting that stuff out, because it was really, like Todd said, I thought it was the most interesting part until I started getting interested in chemical weapons, but I decided not to talk about that today.
In reaction, Bill, do you think then that the administration, or at least the subsequent Nixon memoir and comments about the idea that he had also somehow sent a signal to the Soviets about not striking China might have been an exaggeration based on sort of a desire to take more credit for that?
That's sort of what I thought too. Somehow, it's confusing. It's a little confusing. What he said, this is the Time magazine, right?
Right.
Another question about Cuba, because Nixon didn't really recognize how serious the situation was. It was really close. So if you work at other angles, he talks about Kennedy's confidence, but I don't think anybody knew that Kennedy had to give a lot of ground. Right? The secret deal on the Turks, the missiles in Turkey. But did Nixon even ever know about that before anybody else did? No, there was a secret. Probably not.
I seem to recall, when I first got to grad school, I seem to recall, and that was 1992, that there was a conference on the 30th anniversary. I think Nixon was still alive, and McNamara went to Havana and apparently was stunned to find out that they had got that control of the tactical weapons had been transferred to the Soviet commander, and apparently his face went white. Now, whether Nixon heard about that or anything, I don't know. It's a really good question.
I think at that point, Bill, when Nixon comes in '69, the sense that Kennedy had triumphed overwhelmingly. 13 Days had come out in late '68 as a sort of memoir from Robert Kennedy, and that had also created the image that the Kennedy administration had won this pretty decisively, even though Allison's book had already suggested, of course, that there was some sort of an informal deal.
It would have been my impression that a larger constraint concerning manpower accessions would have been to continue the draft. And the interlude between the time that Nixon gave his remark in the campaign and the time in which the All-Volunteer Force came into being was being used, I think, one, to quell the distrust and unrest in the whole country about the inequities in the draft. And one way of doing that was to say, well, let's start on draft reform. And in the meantime, while we're doing draft reform, and that could be done pretty much within the Pentagon, Laird set that in motion right away. In the interim, we'll work on trying to ensure that we have the proper support in Congress when and if the policy of all-volunteer force recommendation comes into being that we think will be passed. And the 2 to 2.5 years, part of it was the Gates Commission, part of it was an internal commission, Roger Kelly's group within the Defense Department, was used to buy time until you could get and knew that you were going to get the support. Which brings up, I think, contrary to maybe what some think, and a strong element of bipartisanship existed then that we don't even dream about today. It couldn't possibly. We had, for example, George Mahon going to Wisconsin to campaign for Mel Laird, as did John Fogerty from Rhode Island. We have the ABM vote, for crying out loud, as close as 50-50, and the Secretary of Defense managed to get the extra vote on that one to get it passed. And there was not a time, really, in those 4 years, where the final defense bills that were put forward on any important issue weren't passed. They were all passed. So the constraint, I think, would have been if we tried to progress by continuing operation under the old system, we'd have had a tremendous constraint.
I would also add, though, one thing that I think is Barry Goldwater actually favored getting rid of the draft in his Barry Goldwater favored getting rid of the draft in '64, and it was completely out of the question.
There were commission after commission considering getting rid of the draft. They were drafting very few people in the late 50s. There was a serious conversation about getting rid of the draft in 1964. I mean, it did get somewhere, but it was the decision to use the draft rather than the reserves.
Too, even within the defense establishment, the JCS was all uniformly against it, and Westmoreland in particular was strongly against it. The Secretary of Defense had to handle that, and he did. The White House, Nixon thought there were political gains, domestic political gains to be had by getting away from the draft, but he wasn't so bound by it either in an economic or a military sense that he cared much. Henry Kissinger and Al Haig were violently opposed to it, and Haig made a personal campaign going around the Pentagon. So you had to buy time and get the ducks lined up You didn't want to go to Congress that way, and you had to make sure the ducks were all in line in Congress. And it took about 2 years to do that. You couldn't do all these things in 1 year. And there was a time sensitivity and a keenness about what would work and what wouldn't work that I thought was pretty much a virtuoso performance.
Patrick?
This is actually kind of a, I'm an early Americanist, so my question comes with all the usual caveats of ignorance when somebody's asking a question of a specialist. But I'm asking this as kind of that type of outsider. This has been a really interesting process where you've produced these two huge volumes of primary sources and had historians go through them and then share their observations. It's a wonderful exercise, but I've been struck by something that Chris said, and this is kind of a question about constraints, I guess. It's how many of the same quotes were used over and over and over again. I mean, it shocked me because, you know, 2 big volumes, I thought, you know, there'd be enough. I wonder, you know, what does that say, if anything, that, you know, the same quotes came up time and time and time again? Is it just because they're really ripe quotes? Yeah. Or why, yeah, they're good quotes, but, you know, what else is in there? I mean, are there constraints?
Well, you want good quotes, you want to wake people up.
I recognize it, but are there constraints? Are selecting those quotes indicative of constraints that maybe are in this room about the questions you're asking?
We tend to revel, and this is something, of course, Kissinger has commented on about the use of the tapes, that people tend to take them out of context just because they are colorful. People express themselves away from the sort of bureaucratic language that would put everyone to sleep, and they say it in blunt terms. And I think probably all of us have sort of gravitated toward the ones our favorites, but you're right that obviously there's a lot more in there, and we probably could have come up with it if we were a little more creative, but I guess maybe we're not as creative a bunch as historians go.
I think there's a follow-up.
How do you speak to that from a compiler's point of view? When you're putting a volume together, especially if you've done 1 or 2 volumes, and what happens is, as you're going through these tens of thousands of records, there are a few documents that they just speak to you and they say, print me. You know you're going to print about 10% of your documents before you start. Because this one just sings in some way, or it's really key. Now for this period, for example, the National Security Decision Memoranda, you know that with very few exceptions, you're going to have to publish those. Then what do you build around that? So from my perspective, I've mentioned this to both the compilers that the same quotes have been used over and over again. And my statement to them was, you did a good job of finding some of those documents that can encapsulate the whole story in such a way that there is a key record that can sort of tell a larger story in a way that helps historians use that as a shorthand. So that's part of what you look for in a document sometimes, is that does this really in some way summarize the essence of what I think is the compiler this volume is about? Because you're the one putting the volumes together. You know, you make your money. There's a whole bunch of records you know you're not going to use, but you need them for background information. There's very few you know you're going to print from the beginning, but the rest of them, it's sort of your call as a compiler which ones go in and which ones go out, and that's sort of what the role of the compiler plays. So I interpreted this usage of the same documents over and over again. Of course, the tapes in particular is this great and terrible gift. They really lengthen the time it took to do a lot of volumes, but we won't have that kind of resource again, so one hates to not take advantage of it. And we've all had that experience of finding some really pithy quote, but it doesn't really fit the volume, so you don't put it in. So some of the really good stuff isn't in some of the volumes that you would like it to be. So I think that's partly I would say as a compliment to the compiler, they picked records that really help exemplify in a way that it's been exemplified today. So.
I see a couple of follow-ups to the follow-up.
And I'd say great minds think alike.
Richard? I certainly don't want to challenge Bill and say it's not a compliment, but I should say that we all have restricted minutes. I had a list of a gazillion books, and I chose the ones that I thought were the coolest. I'm not sure everyone else did as well. So it's not a question these were the only quotes. They were the ones that we knew would get a reaction, and they did. One person didn't
And I was also trying to, it's hard with these 2 volumes. I decided I'd focus on national security policy only because my own personal interest in it, but to look at the documents that I thought spoke to the larger conference, which turns out, thank God, Richard and others also agreed with me that they were important. I mean, they just jump right out at you. And for me, it was also the fact that, at least from my conception of my presentation, that it hits him so starkly, Nixon, so early on, by February 14th. He's only been in office a little over 3 weeks. And for him, he probably came into office thinking, yeah, I can do whatever I want. And now, boom, it's not. No matter how they try to make him feel better, he doesn't buy it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an issue about using quotes, but we're all human, and part of it is to show the humanity of the people we're dealing with. I mean, just to give you, from a British perspective, I mean, I've been through 2 massive sets of UK archives. One is the Falklands, and now Iraq, and we don't have the tapes. We don't have the verbatim conversation. There's a few. With the Falklands, there were 2 or 3 phone conversations that Thatcher had, but nothing like the record. And you despair at some times of making the stuff come alive. You have these chiefs of staff discussions where you know the personalities of it, that they would have probably been swearing at each other and so on, and you get these driest accounts. So you should be really grateful that somebody was taping, because these are human. I mean, these are human beings. The danger is because we all at times express ourselves in ways that can be quite colourful and fun, to believe that gives a greater insight into actual thought than is the case. Because sometimes, everybody speaks for effect. I just think there's a correction that has to be made. Can I just make one, while I'm talking? The military-industrial complex. I mean, it just brought back another raft of memories of, was it Proxmire? William Proxmire. And the report from the Iron Mountain, but that was a bit earlier, wasn't it? That was during Johnson. There were 2 parts of it. There was one, the government waste side of it, which is Proxmire. Which the best line I can remember from him was, you ask a contractor what the time is and they'll tell you how a watch works. The sheer difficulty of getting at the processes and the cost plus contracts and all that sort of stuff, which was a big issue, and you can see that. But also there was the sheer conspiracy theories, going back to Senator Nye in the interwar years of these people need wars, the permanent war economy and all that sort of thing. I can see how the first was a factor. Was the second anything more than just a sort of a fringe conspiracy thing, or do you think there was...
the attitude, the atmosphere of the country was such as to be very receptive.
Yeah.
And you do see much more of a sort of, I would agree, it's still fringe, but the idea that people are lining their pockets, that this is somehow, what do we need another weapons system for? It may not have been as evilly conspirative as the Nye Commission sort of stuff was, but it's a part of the popular discourse and the newspapers, the use of the term military-industrial complex. Eisenhower, as a good Republican, gave it sanction as a way of going after, to guard against the influence of the military-industrial complex. And so I think it had a little bit more resonance than it might have otherwise. I think that the Eisenhower sanction gave it a lot more.
To do something historians shouldn't really do, speak from experience. I grew up in Smyrna, which was a Lockheed suburb, and we were boycotting Wisconsin cheese when I was a child.
I think we have
because Proxmire was from Wisconsin.
I think we have license to go a couple of minutes over since we got started late. I see a question here, and Professor Jervis.
Sure. I'd like to go back to this issue of economic constraints, especially as they pertain to the interaction between policy decisions over strategic nuclear forces and conventional forces. Just to offer one example from a later period, at the end of the Soviet period, at the end of the 1980s, the drawdown of Soviet conventional forces, but the maintenance of Soviet strategic forces was interpreted as a way to sort of maintain strategic deterrence while removing a very expensive component of the military system, the Soviet military system. It's much more expensive to maintain conventional forces than it is to maintain an offensive strategic force. And I'm wondering to what extent those kinds of notions entered into these discussions we're talking about here between 69 and, say, well, 74. I'm curious if this ever came up in these discussions in these volumes at all.
They certainly did, yeah. No, I think there's one, I don't have the date in front of me, but in which Nixon really particularly makes that point, that what he wants is the strategic systems, partly for also negotiations and strength, as opposed to the, why don't we draw down manpower? It's the Connolly discussion. But certainly that is there. I don't know how effective that was. But,
at the same time, they wanted to
maintain forces in Europe.
Forces,
yes. Yeah. So they were constrained by the fact that American land forces also had the political component.
And I was struck by reading these documents as how similar the discussions were to the 1950s, and how Laird was kind of like Lewis Johnson and the previous Secretary of Defense, and then George Humphrey under Eisenhower. When do you take the words of cutting the budget seriously? Because what happens if you actually do cut the defense budget? Does that really mean that we are going to possibly risk our national security? Especially when, I can't remember who mentioned it this morning, especially when you're getting criticized by the right for abandoning our advantages. And I was struck by that in rereading this volume, and also the SALT volume, and how you have guys like Jackson and Reagan who are starting to say, wait a minute, we're giving up what we have already. And it reminded me of Johnson arguing with Eisenhower about, Truman, and then Humphrey arguing about with Eisenhower about, well, wait a minute, you tell me you want me to cut the budget. Here's what it really means. That means real risks or real cuts. Are you sure that's what you really want? And Eisenhower's, I found the documents that I looked at somewhat contradictory. On the one hand, yeah, we want bigger bang for the buck, but boy, we got to be careful we don't tie ourselves into an all-or-out war.
You have to be careful about using just the dollar numbers all the time, because
sure.
And comparing Laird to Johnson is really not very happy. In my judgment.
I agree. I agree.
The point of Mel Laird's position was one of going to all-volunteer force, where you're going to get a much more capable force per dollar by far than you would have before. And secondly, that when you combine it with the concept of total force, where we're going to use the Guard and Reserve and optimize in a way we've never dreamed of before, and which we've continued to do over all these years. You see a force today that's built just around that concept. The Guard Reserve is nearly 40% of the whole force. And the point is that the concept actually worked. I'm reminded, some people here might remember the Heisman Trophy, he was a football guy again. Glenn Davis, late to practice one day, and Red Blake called him over, said, you're going to run against the first team here. They kicked off to him and he ran for a touchdown. And Blake called him over and said, you didn't follow your blockers here, and we had a line over here, didn't get that. And when he got through, showing him out for all that thing, and said, may I ask a question, sir? Yes. Well, how was it for distance? And in a way, this is what I'm talking about with the manpower part that Laird foresaw, that by combining an all-volunteer force and getting away from all the minuses that go with the draft and combining with a total force concept. And he went even further because he got more on the burden-sharing side out of both Germany and Japan than other secretaries of defense did by quite a bit. We had a more capable force as it worked out. Now, per unit of whatever it is, per unit of modernization, per unit of individual and so on, rates changed. But it didn't change nearly as much as all the dire forecasts had been. And the ability to acquire good, high-quality people never diminished. Even, now part of that is some of the recessions that are going on, that's going to modify things some. The lure of better leadership within the military helped some. The lack of putting social impositions on that you've got to, don't ask, don't tell. If you remove some of those social jobs and so on and just stay with the military, you're going to get a better military. And
I completely agree.
And I think it worked that way.
Absolutely. Last word before coffee break for Bob Jervis.
Couple of quick words. First, on the all-volunteer force, I mean, it has worked out marvelously, but there is a puzzle, at least from a political science standpoint, because it would have been quite reasonable for American decision makers to fear that giving up the draft would be read by allies, right, and adversaries as lack of American will. And yet, I think under the pressures of wanting to do it for other reasons, that perception, I don't think they allowed it.
And the irony is here, look at what the others did. Most of them followed the line and they're going all volunteer force.
We did it before you.
Yeah. But the U.S. I agree. Oh, yeah.
Finger on the trigger and the fear is you lack the will, and this shows you're not even willing to draft. How would you be willing to go to war if you're not willing to draft? I don't think the Soviets did reason that way, but we didn't seem to think that they did.
And an irony is there with how we use the all-volunteer force.
Yeah.
On the economic sanctions, they're channeling to Frank Gavin, you'd expect a change when we go off those. And I wonder if there is, because you don't have the same balance of payment from that really did right. And the third, which is a question for Chris, and the other compilers, this comes out with Richard and me, in terms of declassification. Were you constrained in the sense that you saw documents that you think would have made a substantial difference, much better, that you couldn't get? And did the redactions, we see the amount of, do you think the redactions, obviously you regret them, but do you think they make a significant difference?
You guys?
No, I mean, in my case, I chose documents based on what I thought told the story best, and those were documents that were going to be classified. And I want to actually commend Chris Tudda and other members of the classification staff for saying, I've seen this volume for 7 years, and again, I'm struck by how few there are, with the one exception of Presidential Daily Briefs, which are in here, and they never could get those in night in full. With that exception, I'm not sure there's a whole lot here that will change.
Yeah, Aaron?
I think the salt thing, I don't want to get into the policies of Bruce, but I remember leaving the office in May 2008, having proofread the page proofs, thinking it was going to come out in 6 months, and then lo and behold, it came out 4 years later, doing something about it went back to verification, and once it's verified, it's verified, so maybe Chris can illuminate that as the class person. So I think the salt volume may have been different. I would also recall CIA at one point wanted to declassify documents that had, they were already out for the public. We wanted to have that included, and I caught that and didn't prevail on that.
Yeah, I'm personally, I just finished compiling and I'm working on the revisions of a different volume for Carter. I don't know about you guys, think of whether or not something will be declassified as a reason to include or not to include. I put it in the system and let's hope that it works out. For me, there are certain things we have to live with, certain things that we fight for. And there are certain standard excisions. I won't get into all the details because I can't, unfortunately. But some of it is sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing when it comes to the government. The government, one of the things you discover when you work in our office is how vast the bureaucracy is. And sometimes stuff gets released that they don't even know about. And once they say, oh, wow, it's on the website, you can have it. Or it's been published, or it's been released in a Freedom of Information Act request, but it hasn't gone through first. Oh, okay, then that's fine. I don't believe in ceding anything. We do what we can, and sometimes we have, it's a bargaining thing. As I said before, it's almost like an art. There are certain things we know we want to really put our feet down on, and others we say, well, okay, it'd be nice to have, but it's not the end of the world. And then there are other technical things that oftentimes don't make the volume, that I would argue don't really help the volume, but it wouldn't hurt if they were out. But the government has made, and it's pretty much a standard you know, we go through a process where the agencies do weigh in, and there's a remarkable amount of consensus about what can come out and what isn't, which is surprising. Considering the stuff that we are really discussing, it's pretty amazing that people could make the case, why are you giving away our secrets?
We're
publicly about this, and one of the real great benefits, I think, of these conferences is that it makes public these processes that go through, so that the proofs volumes aren't as opaque or mysterious, which often leads to huge misperceptions, misunderstandings, and actually criticism of the volumes based on insufficient knowledge.
And a final word.
Yeah, one of the things in the volume, and that's your volume, is classified as stockpile numbers. But you know, Robert Gates released the stockpile 2 years ago. Is that making a difference on how the
I don't.
Stuff occur?
I honestly don't know. We might find out. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure we can go on further. Maybe we can do that during the coffee break, but we should break and resume at 10 up. Okay. So thank you.